Before we dive in, don't forget to hit subscribe to follow this story to the very end. You won't want to miss a single twist. Lila Morgan had built her life around control. Every decision, every interaction, every emotion she allowed herself to feel was calculated, precise, and carefully contained. She was untouchable, not because she was cold or distant, but because she had learned the hard way that letting someone in could shatter everything she had worked for. At 28, she had climbed the ranks at Sterling Innovations, a leading tech firm in New York, faster than anyone had expected. Her reputation was that of an impeccable professional, sharp, efficient, and completely unshakable. Despite her success, her personal life was a fortress. Friendships were polite, romantic interests were fleeting, and emotional intimacy was an idea she studied in theory but never practiced. Lila had convinced herself that she didn't need anyone. She had convinced herself that vulnerability was weakness. Then came Alexander Kane. Alexander wasn't just any CEO. He was the kind of man whose presence commanded attention without effort. He had inherited Sterling Innovations at a young age, but unlike the stereotypical entitled billionaire, Alexander's intelligence and charisma set him apart. Lila had worked for him for 6 months, enough to respect his brilliance but not enough to allow herself to notice the subtle ways he seemed to see right through her defenses. It started in the boardroom. Lila had been preparing a pitch for a new AI project, and Alexander had appeared in the room unexpectedly. "You're overcomplicating it," he said, eyes locking onto hers with unnerving precision. There was no arrogance in his voice, only certainty. Lila straightened, feeling her usual composure tighten. "I disagree," she replied, steady and professional. "The complexity ensures accuracy and long-term reliability." Alexander tilted his head, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Perhaps," he said, "but sometimes the simplest approach reveals the truest solution." Then, without another word, he left the room, leaving a quiet tension that lingered longer than Lila would admit. Weeks passed, and small incidents like this began to chip away at her careful walls. A glance in the hallway, a subtle compliment on her presentation, a quiet observation that only she would notice, all of it felt like a gentle intrusion she didn't know how to handle. She told herself repeatedly that she was imagining it, that she had no reason to be distracted. But each interaction left a residue she couldn't scrub away. The turning point came one rainy evening. Lila had stayed late at the office to finalize a proposal. The city outside glistened under streetlights reflecting on the wet pavement. She had just shut her laptop when Alexander appeared, quietly, as if he had been watching her work from the shadows. "You're still here," he said softly, startling her out of concentration. "I had to finish this," she replied, a bit more sharply than intended. "Deadlines don't wait." He stepped closer, his presence filling the small office. "I've noticed how dedicated you are," he said. "It's impressive." His gaze lingered, thoughtful and uncomfortably intimate. Lila felt her pulse quicken. She quickly reminded herself he was her boss, nothing more, nothing less. Yet, there was something in the way he observed her, like he could see the layers she had worked so hard to protect. Before she could respond, the office lights flickered, and a brief blackout plunged them into darkness. Lila's instincts kicked in, she reached for her phone. Alexander, calm as ever, produced a small flashlight from his coat pocket. "Here," he said, holding it steady. The beam illuminated her face, highlighting every detail in a way that felt oddly personal. For the first time, Lila felt her defenses falter. She realized that for all her planning and control, she had never encountered someone who could enter her space without permission and make her heart respond in ways she didn't want. It was a private, fleeting moment, but the impact lingered long after the lights returned. "I should go," she said finally, attempting to regain composure. Alexander nodded, but his eyes didn't leave hers. "You don't have to," he said quietly, almost a whisper. "Not yet." Lila turned away, ignoring the sudden warmth creeping into her chest. She reminded herself of her rules, her principles. She was untouchable, and she had chosen that. But as she packed her bag and left the office, the image of his intense, unwavering gaze followed her like a shadow she couldn't shake. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the city felt different, alive in a way that mirrored the restlessness inside her. For the first time in years, Lila wasn't entirely sure of herself. She realized that being untouchable was no longer enough. Something, or someone, was quietly breaking through the walls she had built, and she didn't know if she was ready to stop it. As she walked toward the elevator, her phone buzzed with a message she hadn't expected. "We need to talk. Tomorrow, 8 a.m., Her stomach twisted. Professional or personal? She didn't know. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to. The next morning, Lila arrived at Sterling Innovations earlier than usual. The city streets were alive with the usual chaos of New York: honking cars, hurried commuters, and the faint smell of coffee drifting from corner cafes. Yet, none of it registered fully in her mind. Her thoughts were consumed by Alexander Kane's unexpected message from the night before. "We need to talk. Tomorrow, 8 a.m. She had no idea what he wanted to talk about. A project, feedback, or something else. The uncertainty made her uneasy in a way she wasn't accustomed to. Lila prided herself on preparation, but this was out of her control, and she hated it. By 7:50 a.m., she was at her desk, reviewing proposals with meticulous focus. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, but she kept glancing at the door. At exactly 8 o'clock, Alexander appeared, as though summoned by her nervous anticipation. He was wearing a tailored charcoal suit, his hair perfectly in place, his expression calm but with that familiar intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Good morning, Lila," he said, his voice low and smooth. "I hope you're ready for a candid conversation." "I'm always ready," she replied automatically, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing how much her calm exterior was already cracking. He gestured toward the small conference room. "Let's sit." Inside, the atmosphere was different from the usual corporate formality. The room was smaller, quieter, and somehow more intimate. Alexander took a seat across from her, hands folded on the table, eyes never leaving hers. Lila sat straight, forcing herself to maintain professionalism, but the subtle awareness of his proximity made her uneasy. "I wanted to talk about last night," he began, and her stomach fluttered at the memory of the lights going out, the flashlight illuminating her face. "You handled yourself well, under unexpected circumstances." Lila blinked, uncertain. Thank you." She shifted in her seat, suddenly aware of how personal this felt. Normally, discussions were about numbers, projects, or deadlines, not moments like this. Alexander leaned slightly forward. "Lila, I admire the way you work. You're meticulous, intelligent, and completely dedicated. But I've noticed something else about you, something you don't let people see easily." Her pulse quickened. "Something I don't let people see." Her mind raced. Was this about work? Was it about her? She couldn't tell. "You guard your heart fiercely," he continued. "I can see why. I can see the walls you've built. But I also see the cracks." Lila's breath caught. This was personal. Too personal. She wanted to tell him that he had no right, that this conversation was inappropriate. Yet, there was a strange pull in his words, a subtle warmth that made her lower her defenses, just slightly. Alexander's expression softened. "I'm not here to break you down, Lila. I'm here because I want to understand you. And because I can't help but notice that, when I'm around, something changes. I see a side of you that's rarely shown." She swallowed hard. Normally, she would deflect with humor or sarcasm. Instead, she stayed quiet, her eyes briefly meeting his before darting away. She didn't know what to say. Nobody had ever spoken to her like this before, not with curiosity, respect, and an intensity that felt almost tender. Alexander tilted his head, sensing her hesitation. "You don't have to answer me now," he said softly. "I just wanted you to know that I see you. Really see you. And I think you should allow yourself to be seen more." The words struck her in a way she didn't expect. She had always believed that vulnerability was dangerous, that letting someone in meant risking heartbreak. But now, facing Alexander's steady gaze, she felt a tiny spark of something new: trust. Perhaps even the faintest hint of desire. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed on the table. It was a reminder about the morning meeting with the board. Lila straightened instantly, forcing herself back into her professional mindset. I need to prepare for the board meeting, she said, trying to sound composed, though her hands trembled slightly. Alexander nodded. Of course. But remember, Lila, this conversation isn't over. Take your time. Think about what I said. And know that when you're ready, I'll be here. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Lila's presentation to the board was flawless, yet her mind kept drifting back to Alexander's words. She found herself analyzing every glance, every subtle tone of voice, trying to understand why he affected her so profoundly. By the time the meeting ended, she realized that the professional walls she had relied on were starting to feel porous. During lunch, she walked through the bustling streets outside Sterling Innovations, trying to clear her mind. But the more she thought, the more she realized that she wanted to see him, not as her CEO, but as Alexander. That was dangerous, recklessly dangerous. Yet the thought persisted. Back at the office, she returned to her desk, only to find a note slipped under her keyboard. It was handwritten, something she hadn't expected in a digital world. You don't have to be untouchable with me. I respect your boundaries, but I hope you'll let me in, just a little, eh? Her hands trembled as she read the note. She wanted to ignore it, to dismiss it as unnecessary attention, but she couldn't. Something inside her, a part she had long denied, thrummed with curiosity, excitement, and a terrifying, thrilling anticipation. By the end of the day, Lila realized she was thinking about Alexander more than she cared to admit. His words had lingered in her mind like a song she couldn't forget. She told herself repeatedly that she couldn't let this go further, that crossing the line between professional and personal was dangerous. Yet, somewhere deep inside, she knew that something had shifted. For the first time in years, Lila Morgan felt a dangerous, exhilarating pull towards someone else, a CEO who had quietly, subtly, and deliberately begun to break through her carefully guarded walls. And she wasn't sure if she wanted to stop it. The week following the note was a blur of schedules, meetings, and deadlines, but Lila found herself noticing every detail about Alexander more than ever before. It wasn't just the way he carried himself, commanding a room without effort, or how his intelligence seemed to shine through every decision he made. It was the subtle kindness in his gaze, the patience in his voice, and the way he seemed to truly see her when she thought no one did. Yet, as much as she wanted to allow herself to feel something, her mind was a battlefield. Lila reminded herself constantly, she was untouchable by choice. Letting someone in was dangerous. Vulnerability was a weakness. And Alexander Kane was the CEO, untouchable in his own right, powerful and influential, with a world she had no place in, except, somehow, she did. It started with small moments. A lingering look across the office during an intense strategy meeting. A hand brushing hers briefly as they reached for the same file. A question posed during a one-on-one discussion that was just personal enough to make her heart race. Each encounter was tiny, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to Lila, they were seismic shifts. Then came the invitation. Alexander asked her to join him for a corporate dinner with investors, a formal, after-hours event at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the city. Lila hesitated. Social events were her weakest arena. She excelled in meetings and presentations, but mingling in glamorous settings, where personal charm mattered as much as intelligence, was a minefield. Yet, underneath the hesitation was a flicker of excitement. She knew he had asked her for a reason, and for the first time in years, she felt something dangerous, anticipation. The night arrived, and Lila spent hours preparing, meticulously choosing her outfit, rehearsing polite conversation topics, and ensuring her demeanor was flawless. Yet, when she arrived, her carefully constructed confidence wavered. Alexander greeted her at the elevator, his tailored suit impeccable, his smile both reassuring and mischievous. "You look remarkable," he said, and something in his tone made her blush, despite herself. The evening unfolded with the usual mix of handshakes, polite laughter, and strategic discussions about investments. Yet, amidst the corporate formalities, Lila noticed how Alexander made her feel like she was the only person in the room. His attention didn't shift to other investors, and his subtle gestures, touching her elbow lightly, leaning in to hear her opinion, sent small, electrifying jolts through her. At one point, they found themselves on the rooftop balcony, away from the noise and chatter. The city lights stretched endlessly, a sea of gold and silver reflecting the stars above. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain from earlier in the evening. Lila felt her chest tighten, unsure if it was from the altitude, the beauty of the city, or the proximity of Alexander Kane. "You seem different tonight," he said softly, eyes fixed on her. "I mean, you're always incredible, but there's something in your presence, something softer. I see it when you think no one is looking." Lila's stomach fluttered. She wanted to respond with wit, with deflection, with anything to regain control, but the words caught in her throat. Finally, she managed a quiet, "I suppose, everyone has sides that aren't always visible." He nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. "And yet, you're extraordinary no matter which side you show. I hope you know that." The vulnerability in his tone surprised her. Lila had never encountered someone who could make her feel simultaneously exposed and safe. She realized she was leaning toward him, not just physically on the balcony, but emotionally, and the realization terrified her. Before she could dwell further, an urgent call pulled them back inside. Investors needed to discuss figures, and the corporate evening resumed its usual rhythm. Yet, even in the crowded room, Lila found her eyes searching for Alexander. He was present, composed, engaging others with charisma, yet she noticed him scanning the room for her, ensuring she was included, comfortable, and seen. Later, as the night wound down, he offered to drive her home. Lila hesitated, but ultimately agreed. The car ride was quiet at first, the hum of the city beneath them. Then Alexander spoke, his voice calm but intimate. "Lila, I know you've built walls around yourself. And I respect them. I wouldn't ask anyone to change who they are." His hand brushed hers briefly over the console, a fleeting touch that sent warmth through her entire body. "But I want you to know, if you ever want to let someone in, I'm here." Her fingers twitched at the contact. The words resonated deeply. She wanted to deny the pull, to remind herself of her rules, but part of her, the part she rarely acknowledged, wanted nothing more than to believe him, to allow herself a taste of trust, of connection, of something more. When she arrived home, she sat in her apartment, replaying every moment of the evening. She realized that for the first time in years, she had not only allowed someone close to her emotionally, she had wanted it. And the frightening, exhilarating truth settled over her: she was beginning to care about Alexander Kane in ways she hadn't anticipated. The next morning at the office, she noticed him before he noticed her, standing by the window with a coffee in hand, looking out over the city. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting second, the corporate barrier dissolved. A subtle smile passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that was quietly forming. Yet, as powerful as the attraction was, Lila reminded herself, this was dangerous. Alexander Kane was her boss, a man of influence and power, and crossing the line could have consequences she couldn't predict. But still, a part of her wanted to risk it. A part of her wanted to see where this connection could go, to test the fragile edges of her own heart. Throughout the day, she found herself distracted. Emails went unanswered longer than usual. Presentations were double-checked, not for accuracy, but for the brief moments she might catch his attention. Small exchanges, the touch of a pen, a shared glance, a quiet word in the hallway, were electric. Each one pulled her further from the untouchable fortress she had carefully maintained for years. By the time she left the office, Lila knew something undeniable: the walls she had built were beginning to shift. Alexander Kane had breached the first line of her defenses, not with force, but with patience, understanding, and a quiet intensity that made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. And as she walked into the cool evening air, she couldn't help but wonder, if she allowed him any closer, how far could her heart really go? The days after the rooftop dinner were a delicate balancing act for Lila. She tried to focus on her work, diving into proposals, meetings, and reports with her usual precision, but her mind kept drifting back to Alexander. Every glance, every subtle interaction felt amplified. She had begun to recognize the ways he made her feel, noticed, appreciated, and, most dangerously, seen in a way no one else ever had. Yet, alongside the exhilaration, a creeping sense of doubt had begun to take root. Alexander Kane was charismatic, brilliant, and undeniably captivating, but he was also her CEO. She reminded herself constantly that mixing professional and personal boundaries could be disastrous. Lila's untouchable walls had been her armor for years, and now they were cracking. The thought of vulnerability terrified her, even as it drew her closer to him. It started with a miscommunication. Alexander had sent her an email late in the evening, asking her to review a high-priority investor report. She read it carefully, noted the deadline, and drafted a response outlining her plan. But the next morning, he called her into his office. "Lila, I noticed some changes in your report," he said, his expression calm but serious. "Some figures don't align with the projections we discussed." "I double-checked everything," she replied, keeping her tone steady. "The calculations are accurate according to the data we received." Alexander leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "I see. Perhaps there was a miscommunication with the finance team. But I need you to review it again. It's crucial that nothing is overlooked." Lila nodded, hiding the frustration prickling at her chest. She had worked late into the night to ensure everything was perfect, and now she felt the sting of doubt, both in her work and, subconsciously, in the growing tension between her and Alexander. After she left his office, she took a moment in the quiet hallway to collect herself. Part of her resented the critique, but another part recognized that Alexander's expectations were high because he believed in her capabilities. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that their connection had shifted in the wrong direction. She was beginning to read signals where none existed, and that realization made her uneasy. The tension didn't end there. During lunch, Lila overheard a conversation between two colleagues in the break room. "I heard Alexander's been spending a lot of time with Lila outside of work," one whispered. "People are talking." Lila's heart thudded. People are talking. She had always been meticulous about keeping her professional life separate from personal feelings, and now she realized how quickly perceptions could twist reality. She wanted to ignore it, to dismiss it as office gossip, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That evening, she stayed late again, reviewing documents under the harsh glow of her desk lamp. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Alexander. "Hope your evening isn't too stressful. Dinner tomorrow. Just the two of us, to discuss upcoming projects." Lila froze. Just the two of them. The professional reasoning made sense. Perhaps a quiet dinner would allow for better focus. Yet her heart raced, and a part of her wondered if he intended it to be something more. She debated replying for a long time before finally typing, "I'll be there. See you at 7. The next evening, Lila arrived at the restaurant. The setting was elegant but understated, with soft lighting that reflected off the polished wooden tables. Alexander was already seated when she walked in, his smile welcoming and warm. "Lila," he said, standing briefly to greet her. "You look stunning." She swallowed the sudden nervousness and forced a polite smile. "Thank you, Alexander. You look equally impressive." They sat, and the conversation began professionally, discussing upcoming projects, investment strategies, and company goals. Yet, even amidst the work talk, Lila felt the familiar undercurrent of attention. His eyes lingered, his hand brushed against hers occasionally, and his voice carried an intimacy she wasn't accustomed to in professional settings. Halfway through the meal, Alexander leaned back and studied her thoughtfully. "You've been quieter than usual," he observed. "Something on your mind?" Lila hesitated, unsure if she should admit the swirl of emotions building inside her. "Just processing everything," she said finally, vague enough to avoid revealing too much. He nodded slowly, a small smile playing at his lips. "I understand. You don't have to explain. But I want you to know that whatever this is between us, I'm willing to be patient. I don't want to rush you, Lila. But I also don't want to ignore it." Her chest tightened. The words were sincere, but they also brought an uncomfortable awareness. She was standing at the edge of something unfamiliar, something fragile. She had never allowed anyone to see the vulnerabilities she kept hidden, and now Alexander Kane was asking her to do exactly that. The night ended quietly, with him offering to drive her home. The ride was silent, but the tension between them was palpable. Lila's mind raced, questioning her feelings, her instincts, and the wisdom of allowing herself to become emotionally involved. When he finally dropped her off, he said only, "Take your time. I'll be here when you're ready." As Lila walked to her apartment, she felt the familiar mix of exhilaration and unease. She knew that letting Alexander in, even a little, was dangerous. Yet, she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. Something in his patience, his attentiveness, and the subtle way he saw her had begun to break through the fortress she had built around her heart. The next morning at work, she noticed subtle shifts in behavior around her. Colleagues whispered, eyes flicking toward her whenever Alexander was nearby. She realized that being near him wasn't just changing her, it was affecting how others perceived her. That thought made her uneasy. Could she allow herself to navigate this connection while maintaining her professionalism? Or was she setting herself up for emotional disaster? By mid-afternoon, Alexander appeared at her office doorway with a soft knock. "Can we talk?" he asked, voice low. Lila nodded, gesturing for him to enter. He closed the door gently behind him, and for a moment, silence stretched between them. "I know this might be overwhelming," he said finally. "I don't want to complicate your life. But I need to be honest, I feel something for you, Lila. And I want to explore it, if you're willing." Her stomach tightened. She had expected subtlety, patient glances, quiet flirtation, but not this direct confession. The intensity of his words made her heart pound, and for the first time in years, she felt truly vulnerable. She began, then stopped, unsure how to articulate the storm inside her. Alexander's gaze was steady, patient, yet insistent, encouraging her to confront her own feelings. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know if I'm ready." He nodded, his expression softening. "That's okay. You don't have to be. But I hope, in time, you'll let yourself consider it." "I'll wait, Lila, I promise." As he left, she slumped into her chair, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Excitement, fear, anticipation, and doubt swirled together. For the first time in her carefully controlled life, Lila realized that the untouchable walls she had built were not just cracking, they were beginning to crumble. And the thought terrified her as much as it thrilled her. The days following Alexander's confession were some of the most confusing in Lila's life. She found herself oscillating between exhilaration and fear, excitement and doubt. Every time she saw him in the office, her pulse quickened. Every time his gaze lingered on her just a second too long, she felt an involuntary shiver of anticipation. And yet, the rational part of her brain, the one that had built walls around her heart for years, kept reminding her of the danger. It was during a Monday morning meeting with the executive team that the first real challenge arrived. Alexander had been unusually quiet, observing everyone silently. Lila noticed the subtle glances he sent her way, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her feel noticed in a room full of people. As the discussion about an upcoming merger heated up, Alexander suddenly turned to Lila. "Lila, I need your insight on the integration plan. What's your assessment?" She blinked, startled to be singled out in front of the board. "Of course," she said, quickly gathering her thoughts. She outlined a strategic approach, highlighting potential challenges and proposing solutions. The room was quiet for a moment before Alexander leaned back, nodding. "Exactly what I wanted to hear," he said, his voice calm but pointed. The subtle tone made her stomach flutter. She had done her job, but she could sense the underlying question: do you have the courage to step outside the safe walls you've built? The meeting ended, but the tension lingered. As she returned to her office, she caught snippets of whispered conversations among colleagues. "They're so close, have you seen how he looks at her?" Lila's face burned. The idea that her growing connection with Alexander was becoming the subject of office gossip unsettled her. She had always been meticulous about her professional image, and now it felt dangerously blurred. Later that afternoon, Alexander appeared at her desk with a folder in hand. "Lila, do you have a moment?" "Of course," she replied, standing and motioning for him to follow her to the small lounge area nearby. He set the folder down on review it thoroughly and make adjustments where necessary. "But, there's also something else." She raised an eyebrow, curious but cautious. He paused, watching her reaction carefully. "I've noticed how dedicated you are, Lila. And I also know that connecting with someone, truly connecting, isn't easy for you. That's fine. I don't expect it overnight. But I also don't want either of us to pretend that nothing is happening between us. Her breath caught. The honesty in his voice was disarming, and for a moment, she felt exposed. Alexander, she began, then stopped. Words failed her, as they often did when her walls were being tested. I know it's complicated, he said softly, leaning slightly closer. But I want to be honest with you. Whatever happens, I don't want to hide my feelings. I just need to know if you're willing to explore this, even a little. She looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously. Part of her wanted to say yes, to let herself fall into the uncharted territory of desire and trust. But the other part, the part that had survived heartbreak, disappointment, and betrayal, warned her to step back. I need time, she admitted finally. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. That's all I ask. Time. The next week was a test of patience and restraint. Lila found herself more aware of Alexander's presence than ever. Every email from him, every brief conversation, every glance across the office seemed to carry double meaning. She struggled to focus on work, her mind constantly drifting to the possibilities of what could happen if she allowed herself to lower her defenses. Then came the unexpected complication. A new project required her to collaborate closely with another executive, someone who was charming, confident, and openly flirtatious. Lila immediately sensed the tension it would create. She had never been jealous, but the subtle closeness she saw between this colleague and Alexander ignited a sharp edge of unease. The collaboration began smoothly enough, but small interactions began to gnaw at her composure. During one late afternoon session, her colleague laughed at something Alexander said, brushing his arm lightly as he turned to respond. Lila's chest tightened. She wanted to speak up, to assert her presence, but the professional environment demanded restraint. Instead, she focused on her laptop, forcing herself to concentrate. Later, when she returned to her office, Alexander was waiting for her. "Lila," he said softly, "you seem distracted. Is everything all right?" She looked up, conflicted. "It's nothing. Just a busy day." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching. "You don't have to hide things from me," he said gently. "I know you're feeling something. I just want to be sure that you understand, no matter what happens with others, I'm here. You don't have to question that." Her heart swelled at his words, but a knot of doubt remained. She wasn't sure if she could fully trust her own feelings yet. The presence of someone else, even unintentionally, had exposed the fragile line between her carefully guarded heart and the new vulnerability she was experiencing. That evening, as Lila left the office, she walked through the quiet streets of Manhattan, replaying the day's events in her mind. She realized that Alexander's patience and honesty were challenging her in ways she hadn't expected. She was beginning to question her untouchable status, and the realization was both thrilling and frightening. When she arrived home, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Alexander. "I know today was complicated. Remember, I'm not asking for immediate answers. Just trust that I'm here, and that I care." Lila stared at the screen, her fingers trembling. She wanted to reply, to reassure him, to bridge the growing distance she felt, but she didn't know what words could capture the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Instead, she placed the phone down, sinking into her chair, her thoughts a tangled web of longing, fear, and anticipation. By the end of the week, Lila realized something undeniable: her walls were no longer intact. Alexander Kane had managed to penetrate the defenses she had spent years constructing. And while the pull she felt toward him was stronger than ever, the first real test of jealousy, doubt, and emotional vulnerability had shown her just how fragile this new connection could be. She knew that the coming weeks would demand courage, honesty, and perhaps a willingness to embrace the unknown. But for the first time in her life, Lila Morgan felt ready to take that risk, even if it scared her more than anything ever had. Because Alexander Kane had become more than just a CEO or a colleague. He had become a presence in her heart she could no longer ignore. The following week at Sterling Innovations was charged with a tension that Lila could no longer ignore. Each day seemed to stretch longer, each glance from Alexander heavier with unspoken meaning. Her untouchable walls had been breached, and now the emotional tug between them was impossible to deny. She tried to focus on her work, but every conversation, every subtle interaction, carried a current she couldn't control. It was on Thursday afternoon that the pivotal moment arrived. Lila had stayed late to finalize a critical presentation for a potential international partner. The office was quiet, the hum of computers the only sound, when Alexander appeared at her door. "Lila," he said softly, his voice low enough that it didn't echo through the empty office. "I hope I'm not interrupting." She shook her head, pushing back a strand of hair from her face. "Not at all. I just needed to finish this before tomorrow." He stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. The room felt suddenly smaller, warmer, charged with a tension neither of them had fully acknowledged until now. Alexander leaned against the desk, his eyes fixed on hers. "I wanted to make sure you're okay. You've been working non-stop, and I wanted to see if you'd like a break." Lila blinked, unsure how to respond. A break in this context could be professional, but the underlying warmth in his tone suggested something more. She shook her head slightly. "I appreciate it, but I need to finish this." He nodded, understanding but persistent. "All right, but at least let me keep you company for a few minutes." "You don't have to talk about work if you don't want to." For a long moment, they sat in silence. The quiet was heavy, but not uncomfortable, rather, it was intimate, the kind of silence that allowed for thoughts and emotions to rise unguarded. Lila felt her pulse quicken with awareness of his proximity. She wanted to pull away, to retreat behind her carefully constructed walls, but some inexplicable force held her in place. Finally, Alexander spoke. "Lila, I can't stop thinking about you. About us." His words were deliberate, soft, yet carried an intensity that made her breath catch. She looked down, feeling the familiar swirl of emotions she had been trying to suppress. "Alexander, we can't, this." He interrupted gently, placing a hand lightly on the edge of the desk, mere inches from hers. "I know," he said. "I know this is complicated. I'm not asking you to make decisions tonight. I want to be honest about how I feel." Her heart raced. The honesty, the intensity, the patience in his voice, it was overwhelming. She had spent years guarding herself, convincing herself that vulnerability was weakness. And yet, here was someone who not only respected her boundaries but also encouraged her to acknowledge her own desires. Before she could respond, he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't have to be untouchable with me, Lila. Not anymore." Her breath caught. The words struck her in a way that left her dizzy. She had imagined moments like this countless times, but reality felt sharper, more urgent, and far more dangerous. The pull between them was magnetic, irresistible. Her body responded before her mind could intervene, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming need to bridge the distance between them. Alexander's hand moved slightly closer, and in that moment, all of Lila's defenses, the years of careful control, the rules she had lived by, crumbled. She realized she wanted this. She wanted him. The revelation was both terrifying and exhilarating. Before she could think twice, their hands brushed, tentative at first, then more deliberate. A spark ignited, one she had never felt before. Her chest tightened, her mind raced, but she didn't pull away. Alexander's gaze met hers, filled with a mixture of desire, patience, and respect. "I don't want to rush you," he whispered. "But I also don't want to hold back my feelings. Not anymore." Lila swallowed hard, her resolve faltering. "Alexander, I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted, her voice barely audible. He nodded, leaning slightly back but keeping his hand near hers. "And that's okay. You don't have to be." "I'll wait, Lila. I'll wait as long as you need." The weight of his patience, his unwavering respect, and the undeniable chemistry between them pressed against her heart. She realized that for the first time in years, she had allowed herself to be vulnerable, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. For the next few minutes, they sat in quiet companionship, the office lights casting soft shadows around them. Lila's thoughts swirled with anticipation, fear, and longing. She knew crossing this invisible line could change everything, her heart, her career, her carefully controlled life, but she also knew that resisting Alexander Kane felt impossible. Eventually, she stood, breaking the tension. I should finish this, she said softly, though her voice lacked its usual authority. Alexander nodded, standing as well. Of course. But know this, he said, his voice low and intimate, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, and when you're ready, I'll be waiting. Lila returned to her desk, her mind a whirlwind. She tried to focus on the presentation, but every detail blurred. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, yet her thoughts were entirely elsewhere, on Alexander, on the intensity of the moment, on the undeniable pull she felt toward him. As the night wore on and the office emptied, she finally saved her work and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The evening's events had changed something fundamental. She had felt, for the first time in years, that she didn't have to be untouchable. She had felt a connection that transcended fear, boundaries, and caution. And yet, the realization brought both excitement and trepidation. She knew this was only the beginning. Crossing the invisible line with Alexander Kane would demand courage, trust, and a willingness to embrace vulnerability she had long avoided. But for the first time, she felt ready to take that risk. Because the pull between them was undeniable, electric, and impossible to ignore. And for Lila Morgan, the thought of allowing herself to fully experience it, despite the fear, was a revelation she couldn't turn away from. The weeks following that quiet evening in the office had changed everything for Lila. She felt lighter, almost as if a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for years had been lifted. Alexander's presence in her life was intoxicating, his patience, his subtle attentiveness, the way he made her feel seen and desired without ever pressuring her. For the first time, she had allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to let someone in completely. Yet, life, as it often does, has a way of testing newfound happiness. It started with a miscommunication that seemed trivial at first but soon snowballed into something more significant. Lila had been assigned a high-stakes project with another department, requiring her to work closely with Daniel Hayes, a charismatic executive known for his charm and ambition. Daniel was skilled, witty, and dangerously smooth, traits that Lila would normally admire professionally but now triggered a subtle unease she couldn't ignore. Their collaboration began smoothly. Lila found herself impressed by Daniel's insights and innovative ideas. Yet, the way he laughed at Alexander's jokes during their team meetings, the way he occasionally leaned a little too close while discussing plans, and the subtle compliments he gave her in passing, all of it set off alarms in Lila's mind. She was hyper-aware of boundaries, but the combination of Daniel's charm and Alexander's growing closeness to her created an emotional storm she couldn't control. It came to a head one afternoon when Alexander walked by the open conference room where Lila and Daniel were reviewing the project timeline. Alexander's gaze landed on the two of them laughing over a minor mistake in the spreadsheet. His eyes narrowed slightly, and Lila felt her stomach twist at the thought that he might misinterpret the situation. Later, in the privacy of his office, Alexander addressed the moment. "Lila," he said, voice calm but carrying a weight she could feel. "I noticed today, the dynamic with Daniel. I trust you completely, but I need to know that we're clear about where we stand." Her heart raced. She wanted to reassure him immediately, to bridge the invisible tension, but words caught in her throat. "Alexander, it's nothing like that. He's just a colleague. That's all." He studied her carefully. "I believe you. I do. But I also need honesty. Not just about Daniel, but about us. I can't navigate this without knowing your feelings, your intentions." Lila swallowed hard. This was the test she had feared. She knew that letting Alexander see any sign of doubt or insecurity could complicate everything they had slowly built. "Alexander, I care about you. You know that. Daniel is just work. Nothing more." He nodded, a faint tension in his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I trust you, Lila. But, I want us to be mindful. I don't want miscommunications, misunderstandings, or assumptions to come between us. Not now, not ever." The weight of his words lingered long after the conversation ended. Lila realized that the invisible line they had just crossed, emotional vulnerability, desire, trust, was delicate. Any disruption, however small, could threaten the fragile bond forming between them. Over the next few days, Lila became hyper-aware of every interaction she had with Daniel, carefully navigating professional boundaries while trying not to make Alexander feel insecure. At the same time, she noticed subtle changes in Alexander's behavior. He was attentive, yes, but there were moments when his eyes lingered too long, when his expressions betrayed concern she knew she had unintentionally caused. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Alexander appeared at her office doorway. "Lila, can we talk?" he asked softly. She nodded, her chest tightening. "Of course." He stepped inside, closing the door gently. "I want to apologize," he began. "I shouldn't have let my emotions interfere with the office environment. I trust you, but seeing Daniel today stirred something in me. And I realize now that even though I want to be patient, I can't ignore my feelings." Lila's heart ached with both guilt and empathy. "Alexander, you don't need to apologize. I understand how you feel. I care about you, and I don't want anything to jeopardize what we have." He walked closer, his expression softening. "That's why I need us to communicate, openly and honestly. No assumptions, no doubts left unspoken. We're navigating uncharted territory, and I don't want either of us to get hurt." The vulnerability in his tone, the quiet intensity of his gaze, made Lila realize just how deep their connection had grown. She had feared this moment, the first real test, but now that it was here, she understood that trust, patience, and honesty were their strongest weapons. For the rest of the evening, they sat together in quiet companionship, discussing boundaries, expectations, and feelings. Lila felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The test had been difficult, but it had also strengthened their bond. She realized that Alexander's patience and willingness to communicate openly had given her a sense of security she had never experienced before. By the time the night ended, Lila knew that while obstacles would arise, and emotions would continue to challenge their relationship, their connection was resilient. They had crossed the invisible line, faced the first real test, and come out stronger on the other side. As she left the office, walking through the quiet streets of New York, Lila felt a sense of exhilaration mixed with a newfound confidence. She had allowed herself to be vulnerable, had communicated honestly, and had trusted Alexander completely. And in doing so, she realized that the untouchable walls she had built for years were no longer necessary. Because for the first time, Lila Morgan understood that being seen, being vulnerable, and allowing someone in didn't mean weakness, it meant courage. And with Alexander Kane by her side, she felt ready to embrace whatever challenges, tests, or obstacles the future might hold. The first real obstacle had come and passed, leaving them stronger, more connected, and more certain of their feelings. And as Lila looked up at the city lights sparkling like stars around her, she knew one thing with clarity: no matter what challenges lay ahead, she was no longer untouchable by choice. She had chosen Alexander Kane, and he had chosen her. The following week at Sterling Innovations carried an unusual energy. The tension, uncertainty, and hesitation that had dominated the last few weeks had given way to something deeper, something undeniable. Lila could feel it in every glance Alexander gave her, every subtle smile he offered, and the quiet ways he made space for her, both physically and emotionally. Their connection had grown stronger through patience, honesty, and small moments of vulnerability, but tonight was different. Tonight, something felt inevitable. It began with an invitation that caught Lila off guard. Alexander sent a discreet message in the late afternoon. "Lila, I know this week has been intense. I'd like to take you somewhere quiet after work. No distractions, no interruptions, just us, eh?" Her heart skipped. Just us. The words were thrilling and terrifying. She knew it was risky, but a part of her longed for it, longed to step fully into the emotional space she had been slowly opening for him. After a few moments of hesitation, she typed back, "I'll be there." That evening, Lila left the office with a mix of anticipation and nerves. Alexander was waiting outside, a sleek black car parked curbside, the city lights reflecting off its polished surface. He greeted her with a warm smile that made her heart race. "You look beautiful," he said softly. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. The drive was quiet, the city lights casting a golden glow over the car's interior. Alexander kept glances on her from time to time, subtle but intent, making her feel both seen and cherished. She felt a flutter of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel fully in years, the certainty that this was where she belonged, at least in this moment. They arrived at a quiet rooftop garden, tucked away atop one of the city's tallest buildings. Soft fairy lights draped along the perimeter, and the view of Manhattan stretched endlessly, the skyline glittering like a sea of stars. The beauty of it took her breath away, but Alexander's presence beside her made it almost impossible to focus on anything else. "I wanted to bring you here," he said softly, standing close but giving her space. "A place removed from everything else, where we can just be." Lila turned to him, her heart racing. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He smiled, his eyes reflecting the soft lights around them. "Not as beautiful as you," he said gently, and her chest tightened at the sincerity in his voice. For a moment, neither spoke. The city noise below was distant, almost irrelevant. It was just the two of them, suspended in a world that seemed entirely their own. Lila felt a wave of vulnerability she hadn't experienced in years, and she realized she no longer wanted to hide from it. "Alexander," she began, voice trembling slightly, I've never felt like this before. I've always been untouchable, protected, safe, but with you, I feel something I can't ignore. I'm scared, but I want this. I want you." His expression softened, a mixture of relief and affection in his gaze. "Lila, you don't have to be afraid. You don't have to guard yourself with me. I want you to feel safe, loved, and seen, all of you. And I promise, I'll never take that for granted." Her breath caught. The words, the honesty, the depth of emotion, everything converged in that moment, dissolving the last of her carefully constructed walls. She realized, with clarity, that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was strength. It was trust. It was the courage to let someone in completely. They stood together in silence for a few minutes, the electricity between them undeniable. Lila's hand hovered near Alexander's, and without thinking, she reached for him. Their fingers intertwined, a simple gesture carrying years of hesitation, fear, and longing. "I've wanted this, for so long," Alexander admitted softly, his thumb brushing over her hand. "Every moment, I've felt something I couldn't ignore. I just needed you to be ready." Lila's heart swelled. "I'm ready," she whispered. The first kiss was gentle, slow, and deliberate. It was a kiss that spoke of trust, of longing, of the culmination of weeks of emotional tension. Lila felt herself surrender to the moment, her body and heart responding to Alexander's presence in ways she had denied herself for years. Every doubt, every fear, every wall she had built melted away under the intensity of their connection. When they finally pulled back, their foreheads rested together, breaths mingling, hearts racing. "I've never felt anything like this," Lila admitted, her voice soft but unwavering. "Neither have I," Alexander replied. "And I never want to lose it, or you." The hours passed quickly as they talked, laughed, and shared small, quiet moments of intimacy in the rooftop garden. The city below continued its relentless pace, but above it all, time seemed to stand still. Lila realized that she had finally allowed herself to be fully seen, fully known, and fully loved, and the experience was transformative. As the night drew to a close, Alexander walked her to the car, their hands still intertwined. "Lila, this is just the beginning," he said softly. "I know there will be challenges, but we'll face them together. I promise." She smiled, a sense of peace settling over her. "I believe you," she said. "And I want to face them with you." The drive back was quiet, comfortable, and filled with an unspoken understanding. Lila felt lighter than she had in years, as if the fortress she had built around her heart had finally been replaced with something stronger: trust, love, and courage. When Alexander dropped her off at her apartment, he leaned in for one last kiss, soft and lingering. "Good night, Lila," he whispered. "Good night, Alexander," she replied, her heart full. As she entered her apartment, she sank onto the couch, reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. The challenges, the doubts, the emotional tests, they had all been part of the journey that brought her here, to a place where she could finally allow herself to love and be loved. For the first time in her life, Lila Morgan was no longer untouchable by choice. She had chosen Alexander Kane, and he had chosen her. Together, they had crossed the last invisible wall, and in doing so, they had discovered something extraordinary: that vulnerability, trust, and love were the greatest strengths of all. The skyline outside her window twinkled like a promise, and Lila knew that whatever the future held, challenges, triumphs, or surprises, they would face it together, stronger, braver, and deeply in love. And for Lila, that was more than enough.